Though often viewed as a Western religion, Christianity did not begin in the West, nor is it now predominantly Western. In truth, its center of gravity has shifted several times in the past 2 millennia. While it is less prominent in lands where it once flourished, such as Europe, it has experienced explosive growth in other areas, especially the global South. If current trends continue, by the year 2050, there will be over 3 billion Christians. Today, the Holy Spirit is drawing people to faith in Jesus with unprecedented speed across South America, Asia, and especially Africa. At the dawn of the 21st century, Christianity is the fastest growing religion on the planet. How did a persecuted movement that began with a small group of Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah become the most widespread religious movement in the world today? The history of Christianity is uneven and filled with tragedy. Persecution, disease, and war threatened it from without. Heresy, corruption, and schism endangered it from within. Yet no matter how many setbacks and seeming defeats the church has suffered, Jesus has and continues to fulfill his promise that he will build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Before his ascension, Jesus left his disciples with a commission and a promise. A commission to spread the good news about him to every ethnic group, tribe, and language. And a promise that they would not be alone. He would send the Holy Spirit to help them, to be with them, and to be in them. The day of Pentecost is often considered the birthday of the Christian church. At the time, there were approximately 200 million people on earth, 60 million under Roman domination. Yet the faith of a small handful of Jewish believers would over the next 300 years grow to become the most popular and ultimately official state religion of the Roman Empire. One of the most important events after Pentecost was the conversion of a strident enemy of the faith, Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul, the forerunner of all Christian missionaries, and the author of at least 1/3 of the New Testament. Paul was executed by Rome in 64 or 65 AD. His death coincided with the next major turning point in the life of the young church, the Jewish revolt. The pinnacle of the conflict was Titus's siege of Jerusalem in 70, in which, according to Roman historian Josephus, 1.1 million perished. The revolt was an unmitigated disaster for Judaism, bringing an end to the sacrificial system, driving the Jews from their homeland. The Romans renamed the land Palestine, their version of the word Philistine, Israel's ancient enemy. The effect on Christianity was also profound, since Rome now made it illegal to become a Christian. Many Christians were certain it was the end of the world. But more than any one event, the Jewish revolt forced Christianity outward. Rome tried again and again to stamp the faith out. Initially, persecution was not widespread, but localized, focused on certain areas or individuals. Nor were Christians always sought out for punishment, but when they were caught, their executions were public, barbaric, and savage. But for early church leaders, the greatest threat came from within. False prophets made claims contradictory to the apostles' teaching. Counterfeit gospels appeared. Heresy forced Christians to articulate clearly what they believed, resulting in a number of creeds. Heresy also played a role in finalizing the canon of Scripture. As Christian numbers grew, so did Rome's animosity toward them. In 250 AD, Rome called for house-to-house raids in the first empire-wide persecution. Believers who refused to denounce Jesus were tortured and killed. In 303, the Emperor Diocletian sought to systematically cleanse the empire of Christianity once and for all. A monumental task, as believers now made up 10 to 20% of the population. It would be the final imperial persecution and the most terrifying. After Diocletian's death, the Emperor Galerius, on his deathbed, called for an end to the killing. Few would have dreamed that the next Roman emperor would become a Christian. In 312, on the eve of a great battle, Constantine had a vision. In the sky he saw this symbol, the first two letters of the Greek word for Christ. He heard a voice say, "By this sign you shall conquer." The next day he won the battle decisively. For Constantine, whose mother Helena had been a believer, it was sure proof that the Christian God was the true God. His conversion would change Christianity forever. Constantine restored confiscated property, gave Christians special privileges, built basilicas, promoted Christians to high office, granted clergy tax exemption. Constantine established Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, as the new headquarters of the Roman Empire, renaming it Constantinople. Under Constantine's influence, the liturgy adopted a formal court-like quality, borrowing many pagan practices. One of his more enduring legacies was his call for the first ecumenical or worldwide council. The Council of Nicaea set a precedent for how orthodoxy, meaning right teaching, would be determined. It also produced the first draft of the Nicene Creed. Constantine may have granted Christianity favor, but it was Emperor Theodosius who made it the official state religion. For 3 centuries, Christianity had been persecuted. In the 4th century, it had been liberated, empowered, and transformed. In the 5th century, the unthinkable happened. Rome fell to the barbarians. Most people were certain it was the end of the world. Within 100 years, the western half of Europe was unrecognizable. The once powerful, unified Roman Empire was now a chaotic smattering of smaller, tribal kingdoms constantly at war with each other. To add to the confusion, many barbarians had been converted to the Arian version of Christianity, which denied Christ's divinity. Their influence diluted the Christian message, but not everywhere. While Rome was collapsing, a former English slave named Patrick returned to the land of his captors and proclaimed the love of Jesus, and Celtic Christianity was thus founded. The change was so profound, Ireland became a launching pad for sending missionaries throughout Europe. In 316, 2 young Christians were shipwrecked in the Red Sea. They were taken as slaves to Ethiopia to serve in the royal court. They were allowed to preach the gospel, and their witness gave birth to the church in Ethiopia. Syrian missionaries, who had carried the gospel to Ethiopia in the 3rd and 4th centuries, now followed long-established trade routes to southern India. They founded native Christian communities that claimed their origins traced back to St. Thomas himself. The eastern, Greek-speaking half of the Roman Empire did not fall to the barbarians and would remain for 1,000 years. It became the Byzantine Empire. Here the emperor was strong and the bishop subservient. The emperor imposed his will on the church. In the west, it was just the opposite. The emperor was now weakened and the bishop became strong. This gave rise to the papacy of the Middle Ages. Leo the Great was the first bishop of Rome to claim total authority over the whole or universal church, Catholic meaning universal. He employed an argument already advanced by previous bishops. Jesus made Peter the rock on which he would build his church, and since Peter died in Rome, the Bishop of Rome was therefore his direct successor. There were 5 sees at the time, that is, a city with a bishop overseeing a large area. The eastern bishops rejected Leo's claim. The center of Christian gravity remained firmly in the east. At the same time, a number of theological controversies surrounding the nature of Christ threatened to tear the church apart. Councils were called to resolve the disputes, but their rulings did not result in the desired unity. The Nestorian and Monophysite Christians were deemed heretics and split away from the church. Meanwhile, the Western Church struggled to create order out of chaos. A devout Italian monk named Benedict wrote his Rule, which became the standard for monasteries throughout the Middle Ages. Monasteries preserved the gospel during the church's darkest days. The church saw its most pure-hearted pope at this time with Gregory the Great. He wrote volumes on Christianity and is considered one of the 4 great Latin doctors, along with Jerome, Ambrose, and Augustine. After seeing blonde-haired Anglo slaves in a Roman slave market, he sent missionaries to their homeland to preach the gospel, the first step on the long road to the conversion of what is today England. With the West in turmoil and the East entangled in theological disputes, neither was prepared for the latest threat that was about to overtake them. In the 7th century, Islam roared out of the Arabian Peninsula with lightning speed. City after city fell to Muslim control. 3 of the 4 seats in the East were now in Muslim hands, leaving Constantinople the lone city overseeing the Greek-speaking church. Islam's stunning success was due to a number of factors, but divisions within Christianity had weakened the church, making those areas vulnerable to attack. Islam made the dire situation in the West even worse. The barbarians had left Europe with no government, no army, no education, no law enforcement. Now, trade routes were cut off, currency dried up, land became the only thing of value. This gave rise to feudalism, a kind of caste system revolving around land, which created extremes of wealth and poverty and led to a perpetual state of war. Most people were certain it was the end of the world. Beyond the Muslim world, Nestorian Christians carried the gospel along the Silk Road, deep into Central Asia and China. In 635, they were welcomed at the imperial court in China's capital city of Chang'an, the largest city in the world at the time. In England, Anglo-Saxon Christians sent missionaries to Germany. The most notable was Boniface, who is best remembered for challenging local pagans by chopping down their sacred oak tree. When the pagan gods did not smite him, many converted to Christianity. In his old age, after years of successful ministry, Boniface and his companions were ambushed by a gang of militant pagans and murdered. The Eastern Church became increasingly traditional out of necessity for survival. One hotly disputed tradition was the use of icons or images in worship, a practice long accepted in the East. Many in the West felt this was a throwback to paganism and violated the commandment that prohibited making graven images. The Second Council of Nicaea, which sought to resolve the matter, resulted in a compromise. Worship was due to God only, but icons could be used for veneration of saints. The Western Christians were not happy with this ruling. The stage was set for the split between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Second Nicaea would turn out to be the last truly worldwide council. In the 8th century, Islam expanded as far as Spain. Europe might have become Muslim, but for a new emerging power, the Kingdom of the Franks. A young Frankish king named Charles Martel repelled the Muslim army at the Battle of Tours. His grandson Charles pushed the Muslims back into northern Spain. Charles also came to the defense of Pope Leo III, who was under investigation for corruption. During Christmas Eve Mass 800, while Charles was kneeling in prayer, the grateful Pope placed a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the new Christian Roman Empire. The reluctant king accepted the title, becoming Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. The Holy Roman Empire would last for 1,000 years until Napoleon brought it to an end in 1802. Charlemagne became a father figure to the continent, setting in motion a number of vital reforms. Unfortunately, none of his successors had his abilities. The relationship between emperor and pope became factious, each vying for power. With its sphere of influence shrinking, the Byzantine Empire pushed north and northwest to the Slavic people. The most important event for the Orthodox Church was the conversion of Russia in 988 at the invitation of the King of Rus, Vladimir I. His mother Olga had been a Christian and envisioned Moscow as the third Rome. several attempts were made to reconcile the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Unfortunately, that proved to be impossible because of the West's insistence upon papal authority. In 1054, leaders from both East and West excommunicated each other. Their long drawn-out separation was finally a divorce. After 4 centuries of Islam's aggressive advance, church leaders wanted to take back the Holy Land. The Catholic Church instigated 7 major crusades over a 200-year period. Most of the crusades were failures, and some total disasters. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, Muslims, Jews, and Arab Christians. At the same time, the plague broke out, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, wiping out as much as 60% of Europe's population. Most people were certain it was the end of the world. The Crusades did, however, open up trade routes, causing commerce to flourish. Once again, money flowed to and from Europe. New wealth led to the growth of cities and a new class, the bourgeoisie, meaning people from the city, people who made their wealth by trade and later by industry. This led to the end of feudalism in the West and the beginning of capitalism. To counter the excesses of the new affluence, poverty-based monastic orders appeared, which supported themselves by begging. Most prominent were the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who took the gospel along the Silk Road to Central Asia and China in the 13th century. The Franciscans were started by Francis of Assisi, perhaps the most beloved Christian of the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, the church grew very wealthy, owning as much as a third of the land in Europe. The papacy reached its zenith with Pope Innocent III. He made it a capital offense to read the Bible in any language but Latin. No pope before or since has wielded as much power, and he called himself the supreme sovereign of the world. After Innocent III's death, the papacy slid into rapid decline, including a 70-year period when the papacy was in France. This resulted in the Great Papal Schism, in which there were as many as 3 competing popes. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. The center of Christian gravity was now solidly in Western Europe. Time and again, earnest Christians called for reform. They were usually met with violent resistance. Many thought calls for reform were pointless, convinced the church was hopelessly corrupt. Instead, they sought to reclaim the best of the ancient civilizations. This rebirth or renaissance began in Italy and spread throughout Europe. Over time, the church itself was caught up in the spirit of the age. The Pope sought to make Rome a Renaissance city. This included the construction of one of the most exquisite buildings in the world, St. Peter's Basilica. To accomplish this, the church needed cash, lots of it. This led to the sale of indulgences. An indulgence was a papal certificate designed to provide proof of the forgiveness of sins. On the night of October 31st, 1517, an Augustinian monk tacked a piece of paper to the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany. On it were 95 questions about the nature of salvation, refuting the sale of indulgences. The door functioned as a kind of bulletin board for scholastic discussion, and he hoped to generate some dialogue among his colleagues. This hardly seemed like the start of a revolution, but Martin Luther was in the right place at the right time. His action set in motion a chain of events few could have imagined. It would change Christianity forever. There had been countless calls for reform, but Luther had one weapon at his disposal that previous reformers did not have: the printing press. His 95 Theses quickly became the world's first bestseller, its author the most beloved and reviled man in all of Europe. The Catholic Church was largely unprepared for the Reformation. The swiftness with which people abandoned her authority revealed the depth of resentment that had been simmering for generations. Zwingli brought the Reformation to Zurich, Switzerland, followed by John Calvin, who taught that it was not only the church that needed reform, but society and politics as well. In contrast, the Anabaptists rejected any alliance of church and state. King Henry VIII broke away from Rome, creating the Church of England. If the Roman Church was to survive, it could no longer ignore the challenges presented by the reformers. In the middle of the 16th century, the Council of Trent, which lasted 18 years, sought to define Catholic doctrine in what is often called the Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation. One of the most important Catholic groups to arise at this time was the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius Loyola. Many were fiercely anti-Protestant, yet the Jesuits sent numerous missionaries to the New World, North and South America, and to the East. Jesuit missionaries believed outsiders must respect customs and rituals of indigenous people as long as they are not sin. But their successes were undercut by Rome. Church leaders would not allow indigenous people to be promoted to high office, nor was the Mass to be held in any language but Latin. This perpetuated the idea that the Jesuits were imposing Western culture on others. When the Catholic and Orthodox churches split in the 11th century, they were already divided geographically. Not so with the Protestant Reformation. As a result, 100 years of religious wars followed the Reformation. Many Christians were certain it was the end of the world. These wars and internal conflicts gave rise to rationalism as intellectuals sought to bring order to this volatile state. In Great Britain, rationalism led to deism, the belief that God is not involved in the affairs of men. In France, it led to the bloody French Revolution, which greatly reduced Rome's power and influence. Others placed more emphasis upon a personal experience of God. John and Charles Wesley founded the Methodist movement, which sprang out of the Church of England. The 16th century was a time of great upheaval. It had given birth to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, 100 years of war, and the exploration and conquest of the New World, the Americas, which greatly expanded Europe's influence and jurisdiction. Spain's conquest of the New World began in the West Indies and spread through Latin America and parts of North America. While the Spanish sometimes destroyed native populations and introduced slavery, they also sought to convert local populations to the Christian faith. In the 17th century, England and France explored and conquered parts of North America. The British colonies in North America were made up of various Christians longing to get away from the religious persecution in Europe, the Puritans, the Pietists, the Quakers, the Baptists, and so forth. In the 18th century, a revival called the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. The most important leader in this movement was a Calvinist preacher named Jonathan Edwards. Calvinism played a vital role in the founding of the United States of America. For the first time since the days of Constantine, Christianity in Europe was marginalized. Many Christians were certain it was the end of the world and launched what has been called the Great Protestant Missionary Century. Evangelical missionary groups sprang up all over Europe and America. The Moravian missionaries carried the gospel to Africa, the Far East, the Arctic, and North and South America. Robert Morrison was the first Protestant missionary to go to China. Robert Moffat went to Africa, William Carey to India, Hudson Taylor to China, Robert Bruce to Iran, David Livingstone to Central Africa, Methodists went to Argentina, Presbyterians to Korea, Baptists to Northeast India, Anglicans to Nigeria, Congregational missionaries to the Pacific Islands, and on and on. While European churches lost nearly half their members, the 19th century saw the greatest proportional increase in believers than at any time since the 5th century. Once again, the center of Christian gravity was shifting. The culmination of a century of Protestant missions was a missionary conference held in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1910, chaired by John Mott. It marked the beginning of a modern ecumenical cooperation in missions. New technology, mass communication, the internet, and faster travel have enabled the Church to fulfill the Great Commission in a way not conceivable in times past. Every generation of Christians, from the apostles onward, is convinced that their generation is the last one before Christ returns. But one of them will be right.